Um, looking at particularly the way John deals with the crucifixion. Okay. He does some very unique things that the others don't. And we pick up different pieces from all of them. So let's go delve into John's approach. Okay. So the question, and I've been asked this times, why did God have to make Jesus go through the cross? What caused the cross? What was it that sent him to the cross exactly? Through the years, people have asked who killed Jesus. John's gospel gives several answers with different levels of meaning. That was essentially the issue behind the Holocaust. You Jews killed Jesus, right? So we're going to wipe you out. It was your fault that Jesus died. That is a particularly agitating, separating concept that comes up periodically throughout the centuries. And that was the worst rendition of it. But the question does come down to who killed Jesus. John says there are two options here. The world killed Jesus. Okay? The world rejected Jesus. The world, and here it could mean cosmos, or it could mean in the cosmos, the first universe, including humanity, all of creation, in other words. And the second is more narrow. Hello, Ann, come on in. Second meaning is humanity itself, its attitude towards self-interest. If you think about what is it that continually was an issue for Jesus, where people got concerned and agitated against Jesus, came from all kinds of corners. Romans, the authorities of the Jewish people, and all this stuff. And the issue was always self-interest. If you look at past, if Jesus is really who he says he is, claims he is, and comes and becomes evident to all of us, then what I have built my world around is just gone. Okay, my self-interest is secondary if, in fact, God is telling me this is the way to go, and my self-interest is wanting to send me in a different direction. That's, in some corners, that's the kind of thing that develops a mob reflex against an agitator, against the one who's telling you you're all wrong, and gathers a crowd about that. Well, then there's a crowd against it that develops. Okay? So humanity's self-interest is something that John thinks is really serious here. And with the second meaning, John is saying the world turned its back on Jesus. And in the prologue of John, he says, he was in the world, yet the world did not know him. From the very beginning of this gospel, we are hearing the seed of what's going to develop. Okay? He was in the world. He was at creation. The Word became flesh, dwelt among us, and the people turned their back on him. Light came into the world, John says, but people loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. When lights turn on, the rats scatter, right? Yeah.
Not the word world be closer described as community, because talking about a confined area. We're not talking about the Greeks, just talking about the Roman influence community tribes right there. It's a small community.
It was, and that's you could say their world. But when John's writing this, he's not restricting. He says the whole cosmos is involved. This is and we see this at the end. The cosmos is involved in the sense that God's whole creation was at risk because the people refused to accept Jesus, and the whole of creation. Well, we're going to get into it further, but yes, the immediate people right there in Jerusalem, you could say that's their world. No, I'm not going to do. You can read it that way. Okay. The other thing that he says is the reason that Jesus was killed is sin itself. Sin in John's gospel is not, not doing the Ten Commandments. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is the acts. It's not the acts of breaking God's law. It's rejecting Christ, and it resulting acts because of that. Refusing to accept forgiveness, refuse or healing, or shepherding love. The world said Jesus hates me the world said Jesus hates me because I testify against it, that its works are evil. You get a hellfire and brimstone preacher up there telling you what you're doing is absolutely wrong, and they're not going to like it very much. When the light came in, sin became visible. In some sense, human rejection of divine love, sin of all centuries, must be cause for the crucifixion of Jesus. And not the sin of that particular community. This is something that translates into all times. Global at that time, but also throughout the centuries. It's a repeatable thing. That rejection of God's love. John often refers to Jesus' immediate adversaries in the community as the Jews. But the term is complicated. The Greek word ion dioe, that's the best translation I can say, or it's a difficult word. That can be translated Judeans or Jews. So a person in Galilee might refer to the people in Jerusalem, that is the people of Judea, as Jews. Or in fact, they're all Jews. But they may refer to the ones down south in Judea as Jews. Jesus was a Jew, so were Mary, Martha, Peter, and John. So were the 5,000 who wanted to make Jesus king. So were the throngs at Passover who waved the palm branches and shouted Hosanna. But John's gospel uses the phrase in a particular sense. By the Jews, John meant the Jewish religious authorities in Jerusalem who clearly opposed Jesus. Unfortunately, across the centuries, Christians have misunderstood John's use of the phrase. Hey, Barbara. There we go. Across the centuries, Christians have misunderstood John's use of the phrase the Jews, taking it to mean all Jewish people. As a result of that misunderstanding, many Christians have tended to think of Jesus, the disciples, and most of the early church as non-Jews. For John, the expression clearly points to the powerful Jewish establishment who held hands with Rome and governed everyday life of the people. Have you heard people say, well, Peter, Paul, and Mary,
Yes.
and all the other bands around? No, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and the all the disciples and everybody, they were Christians. They weren't Jews. They were Christians. They were Jews. They were raised as Jews. They participated in all the sacrifices and all the things, Passovers, all the festivals. They were Jews. And it isn't until Paul goes to someplace where the followers of Jesus are first called Christians. I've forgotten the
Ephesus, maybe?
no, not Ephesus. It's in today in Syria.
Okay.
But I can't. It just doesn't come to me. Okay. Irony of ironies. Without doubt, John says the religious leaders were part of the human instrument that crucified Jesus. They sent a detachment of temple police and Roman soldiers to the garden to arrest him. Then they took him to one authority after another. They brought the accusation to Pilate. Now, the irony is overwhelming. The leaders send at night a small army to capture a man who had been teaching in the temple in public for weeks. Okay? When Jesus said, I am he meant more than a mere identification. Even as he gave himself up, he used the divine I am. But what was most ironic, these religious leaders periodically praised God as Lord and only King of Israel. They sang enthronement psalms in the temple. The Lord is King, let the people tremble. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord, for the Lord is great and a great King above all gods. And because Jesus claimed that kingship, they whisk him off the Pilate. Pilate asked, shall I crucify your king? They answered, we have no king but the emperor. In direct opposition to the song, which they all sang in the enthronement period. In so doing, in saying that, in John 19, they denied their faith, they denied their covenant commitment to God, their only king, and they denied their identity as people of God. Striking that the denial of Jesus as king, and they're bringing him that charge to Pilate. Why? Because the charge that they really wanted to bring him up as is Jesus claimed to be God. If anybody claimed to be God, the threat to the Roman Empire, the threat to his position in the Roman Empire is another king amassing an army and he having to put down an insurrection. And I'm probably going to say all that again in a slide here. The Roman Empire also played a part in the crucifixion. Herod Antipas, Roman governor, had soldiers on the lookout for Jesus. Roman soldiers joined with temple guards to arrest Jesus in the garden. Only John's gospel shows both Jewish police and Roman soldiers at the arrest. Roman soldiers taunted him. They stripped him. They pressed thorns on his head and gambled for his garments. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, was enforced by Rome's iron fist. Jewish authorities knew that one miscue on their part or one rebellion by a band of zealots could topple the temple, strip them of power, even destroy the nation. The word that clinched the verdict was the word Rome feared most, the claim to be king. he sets himself against the emperor. Pilate played a part. But I gotta back up just a second. When Herod Antipas, remember the musical Godspell? Godspell got it right. When he goes to Herod bursts into song. So you are the Christ, you're the great Jesus Christ. Da, da, da. And he wanted him to perform miracles. He wanted to see him do stuff. And the whole farcical image is just nailed on. Now, Pilate doesn't have that kind of a farcical image in Godspell. And Pilate was a very serious guy. He, when Jesus told Pilate he had no power over him, unless it had been given to him from above, Jesus may have meant from God, or may have meant from the emperor. If the emperor gave him power over him, or it could have meant both. But Pilate knew well that his authority came from the emperor and rested on his ability to keep order in Judea. That's his job. Don't mistake Pilate for a nice guy. Political expediency and compromise governed his thinking. He disliked Jews. Whenever he thought he had to, he killed Jews by the thousands. He despised the religious government because he didn't understand it. In Jesus' trial, he granted their wishes, yet humiliated them at the same time. He paid no attention to their charge that Jesus said he was God. That was their law, not politics. He made the accusers change their charge to sedition. His fear was not of Jesus, who had no soldiers. His fear was of an uprising followed by a necessarily heavy-handed Roman crackdown. Pilate's fear was that Rome would get word that the job was too big for him. He couldn't handle it. There we go. The religious authorities accused Jesus of claiming to be a king. Pilate would give them a king, flog him, dress him in purple, put a crown of thorns on his head, parade him around, make a mockery of the whole thing, of the whole idea that Jews had a king. He says the word sat in the phrase, he sat on the judge's bench. It can mean that he was seated. He seated him on the judge's bench. What a gesture that would have been, putting Jesus on the judge's bench. Here's your king. The double meaning for our gospel is clear. They thought they were the judge, but they were being judged by the king. Pilate went further. The procedure was to tie a charge or inscription around the criminal's neck and nail it to the cross. Jesus said he was king. They said he claimed to be king. So be it. The inscription read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. For all to see. Say, now, I have difficulty dealing with Satan in a personified concept, okay? That's not my understanding of evil in the world. We don't have a good God and a bad God, okay? And even if that bad God's a lesser God, doesn't matter. The people of the day understood the concept of Satan in a totally different way than I do, and I don't know about the rest of you. But we've got to deal with it here because Satan is, that concept of evil is so penetrating that we're talking about the cross, Satan played a role for sure. Clearly in our gospel, the battle is waged between principalities and powers. Jesus called Satan the ruler of the world. He called him a murderer and a liar and the father of lies. Jesus knew he fought against Satan. He knew full obedience to the Father would break Satan's powerful grip on the world. In his farewell talk with the disciples, Jesus said, "The ruler of the world is coming. He has no power over me." Amid betrayal and denial, Jesus would stay faithful to the end. Amid lies, Jesus would speak truth. Amid hatred, Jesus would love. Satan's power would be broken when Jesus was lifted up on the cross. Did God the Father cause Jesus to be crucified? Christians reading Hebrew scriptures through their experience of Jesus saw the sacrifice foretold. The prophet Isaiah wrote, "He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." 53rd chapter of Isaiah is immeasurably fixated on the role of the Messiah and how that ends up. And this is it. Jesus saw scriptures being fulfilled. So did the early church. On the cross, Jesus prayed Psalm 22. Parts of his ancient lament almost seem to be an eyewitness account of the crucifixion, beginning with Jesus' own utterances. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Notice how Jesus' experience fulfilled the psalm. The soldiers derided him, "Hail, King of the Jews! All who see me mock at me." The soldiers gambled for his seamless robe. They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. That's in Psalm 22. It's almost eerie when you look at that psalm and Isaiah 53 and the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. No wonder the early church saw the fulfillment of the covenant, the tie to the Jewish heritage. But what next? That's not foretold. What next? A new Israel, a new faith, a new covenant. All of that is wide open to experience and to develop. But being the foundation goes back so far into their traditions, cannot be ignored. This was evidence to those early folk that this was the Messiah. This is the one. They don't get it until after the resurrection. Okay. It took them 3 days to get there. Okay. The key question of God's involvement is their understanding of the cup. The Synoptic Gospels record Jesus' agonizing prayer in the garden. My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. And we're told that he sweat drops of blood in that prayer. I mean, this is not a passing fancy. This is foreseeing what's coming and asking to let it go, to move in a different direction. But the cup in John's understanding is very different. In John's gospel, the cup is the gift of the Father, freely accepted by the Son, because drinking it was essential to the work God gave him to do. That's a whole different attitude. That's a whole different response to the recognition of what's going to happen. The mission given to Jesus required Jesus to drink the cup of suffering. The Father required the Son to be faithful and obedient to death. What about Jesus' role? From the beginning of his ministry, Jesus knew his hour would come. He was not taken against his will. He made himself available. Jesus was in control of his life. No one takes it, that is his life, from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this commandment from my Father. Jesus could have said no to his mission at any point. His going to the cross is the greatest love act of all time. The works and the witnesses were not enough. Remember, he told Nicodemus, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, that is to bring healing, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. If you'll recall the event in the wilderness, there was a breakout of snakes, and they were deadly snakes. And those snakes were having fun with a couple million people. Okay. And they came to Moses and said, "We got to do something about this, boss. What's going on?" And he took one of those stakes and put it on a post, and like that, and raised it up, and so all could see, and all who could see it were healed. That's one of those beautiful, buried stories we don't tell very often in church, right? What's that?
What?
If they could see the snake raised up by Moses, they were healed of their snake bite. Because the snake bite was deadly. Look again at the image of the cross with Jesus hanging from it. So just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, the Son of Man will be lifted up, that whosoever believes in him will have eternal life. And that's as early as the 3rd chapter of John. This is not all happening at the, right at the event. This is John's building this stuff into the gospel so that when the event comes, there's more understanding. John's gospel, the cross is love shining amid hatred, fidelity amid rejection. Glory is not resurrection after humiliation. Glory is love on the cross. Now we understand what Jesus meant when he said, "Where I am going, you cannot come." His cross was a place no one else could go, an act of love no one else could perform. In crucifixion and resurrection, he would glorify the Father. And the church, looking back, would understand. The cross was a once for all act of love by the Father through the Son for the world. I wanted to turn around and take a look at that picture hanging there, that black and white. That's my favorite picture I ever got in the world. I got that first year I was in ministry. And I don't think you can see that way. You have to turn around a little bit, Nancy. But anyway, I've told the story of that picture a time or two, but it really fits in well here. When I first started in Albuquerque, a young couple came up to me and asked me to have their wedding. And to get to know each other a little bit, they invited us over for dinner one night. And we got to this apartment, and they were students at the university. And it really was striking. There was that picture in a little 5x7 sitting on the table on the side of the sofa. And I was just knocked out by it. I said, "Who kept the picture of the crucifixion?" Where'd that come from? What kind of a Polaroid was by the cross? And the sun behind it and the black and white, it just was stunning. I said, I'll tell you what, if you'll make me a big picture of that, if you'll redo that picture for me, I said, that's I'll do your wedding for nothing. Yeah. Let's do a little trade-off here. And so he had that ready for me at the time of the wedding. And turns out in Albuquerque, there is a Catholic cemetery that has a life-size crucifix in the middle of it, and that's it. And he got that picture right when the sun was at the crossbars. I just it was so stunning. Catholic, the reason I mention that is the Catholic Church doesn't have a bare cross, has a crucifixion, crucifix. And the crucifix, I got to back up and tell you another story. It all ties together. But before we went, I took a group to Israel back in '96. And before we went, just a couple nights before we went, there was a movie on television. It was just crazy robbery kind of a thing. And the one guy, before they go in to rob this jewelry store, one guy says the other way, he says, go on over and talk to the jeweler while I'll get some, the stuff. And he says, oh, okay. He says, diversion, right? So he goes in and he's trying to strike up a conversation with this jeweler. And he says, you got any of those little crosses with a little man on them? And I lost it. Well, the reason I mentioned it is when we went on this trip, we had one teenager and about 20 adults. And I thought, this kid's going to be so bored she can't stand herself. And I said, so in the bus, I think coming out of Tel Aviv, I said to her, told her the story of this guy. And I said, we're in Israel. I said, how many crosses with little men on do you think we could see? And so we started hunting out the crucifixes in Israel and got several hundred, all the stores have different ones and everything. But the idea that Christ is still on the cross is the center point of the Mass. And that is the blood and the body are there and taken in. And it is the sacrifice that is important. Where Calvin broke off of that, he says, no, the sacrifice is made once and for all. And that's what John's Gospel says. And so the sacrifice has been made. Focus should not be on the sacrifice, but on the resurrection. So that we had the bare cross. There was another story there. Forget it. Let's go. Hold on. Sorry. The hour. In John's Gospel, the crucifixion took place in the afternoon of the day of preparation. I talked about that a little bit last week. On that afternoon, the Passover lambs are sacrificed, their blood drained, and the animals given to the families, back to the families for the Passover meal. Passover lambs were being sacrificed at the time of Jesus' death. He truly was the sacrificial lamb. When the sour wine was placed on Jesus' lips, when he said, I thirst, the soldier used a branch of hyssop. And that's the top picture. It's kind of hard to see that he's holding that up with this branch. It is the same plant used by the Israelites to put the blood on the Passover lamb on the lintels of their homes in Egypt. That blood caused the angel of death to pass over their homes, allowing their children to grieve and to live. But the hyssop stick, I mean, talk about symbolism. Goes all the way back to pre-Exodus. All of that's wrapped up in this one event. Symbolism is overwhelming. Now the church is remembering the words of John the Baptist, coming from the first chapter of John. Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. No, not sins, sin of the world. Now, what are we going to do about it? Next week, go tell. Post-resurrection, what instructions did the disciples get? Post-resurrection was the church doing with what it has in message and in capability. A lot of questions in there. And we'll get into some of them next week. Meanwhile, what's your response to John's crucifixion?
Like how you drew in all the, Moses, that, and each event and how it lines up.
John's an interesting guy. We assume he was Jewish. He knows the tradition so well. He must have been of a Jewish tradition. This was written, I think I've said before, probably in the 80s, first century. It was the last gospel for sure to be written. And it takes such a different approach. He's looking for meaning the whole time. He's not just chronicling events, right? He's picking out, he's not trying to tell his readers everything Jesus did. He's pointing out events that point to who he is and point beyond him. And he's pointing out events that are just reek of meaning, And he doesn't worry about chronology. He said he's got the cleansing of the temple as the first act of his ministry, right? He has disciples before he gets out of the first chapter. It's such a different approach. It comes more from the writings of the Old Testament, that tradition, looking for meaning, not just chronicling events. The chronicler, the first and second chronicles that we went through, realized that body, we always look at it as history, but it's very specific in chronicling events that point, again, beyond itself toward who the Jewish people are in their relationship to God. It goes back not to Moses like kings do. It goes all the way back to Abraham. No, not Abraham. Yeah, it goes back to Abraham. And the covenant, bringing the covenant forward. Here, he's showing how the Jews have broken the covenant. And he's about to reestablish a new covenant. See? So this is not just formed out of whole cloth. This is something that's really crafted to begin to prepare the reader from the first verse. In the beginning was the Word was made flesh, all the way through post-resurrection. And by starting back at creation rather than in birth, saying from the very beginning, this is God's work. You know, church can fight for centuries over who is the daddy, Jesus. Is Joseph really the daddy? Or did God adopt him? Or did the Holy Spirit do something? Or why did it misinterpret the Isaiah passage and say virgin birth? You know, this kind of thing. He doesn't care about that stuff. What he's saying is God came to earth to be with us, show us what he meant for us to be, and prepare us to be able to do that, to be that people again.
So probably next week you'll get into, well, maybe a little bit, just the differences in the resurrection story, right? Like, you know, the different accounts if you look at the different gospels. But when you look at the gospels and actually the build up to the crucifixion, are they pretty consistent? Are there any differences that kind of that's a big inconsistency, like you might see the other gospel when it comes to the resurrection?
I think they all do the same thing, and that is they're trying to prepare their readers for the resurrection. You can't just pop that on people, right? You know, it's not something that was unexpected. It was unexpected for the time, but it was something that Jesus was pointing to his whole ministry. And each one of them picked stories that for them help prepare them for the big time. The last week, Palm Sunday to post-resurrection appearance, takes up fully a third of the entire Gospels. If you count the pages, a third of the Gospels are just focused on that last week in post-resurrection. And so that's the event everybody's looking toward. They all do that. Question is, where do they start, and what points do they bring out that help people get to that point where they can understand and accept the resurrection? And without the resurrection, there is no gospel. Because without the resurrection, there's just a death. And then the church spent, I don't know, 500 or 600 years fighting over what happened to Jesus during those 3 days. Where was he? And so we say he ascended into hell. Why not? He must have been somewhere, you know. He didn't dissolve. So he's taking away the sin of the world, so he must have gone to hell in order to do that and resurrected from it. But I think I mentioned last week that descended into hell is in parentheses. It's not in the original. Tenet of faith. What do you think? Anything else?
So they were first called Christians at Antioch,
There you go.
but I Googled it. It had nothing to do with it.
It's Antioch of Syria,
Right.
and there's another Antioch in
Turkey.
Turkey. Sure.
We're moving along now. October, right? October, no. January, February. When are we getting to the book? When are we getting? Is it the last?
We're going to spend at least 2 months in Revelation.
The last day of Sunday school?
We're going to spend at least 2 months in Revelation.
2 months.
At least.
March, April.
No, April, May. We'll probably start in March.
You got a commitment, right? Was that a commitment?
I think it's tapes too, so you can
Shoot.
Yeah, if you want to refresh your course, just go look online. You can go over all this.
I couldn't find it, Larry. You guys say it's online, but our
It's-
website is not easy.
I know, and I had to work to find it too. It is ministries, education, adult, and then basic Bible or beyond basic Bible. I tried to get them to change the name just to Basic Bible. And they said, not an easy thing to do, to change the name, because originally I changed the name every year. But anyway, so it's listed beyond, I think, beyond Basic Bible. Okay, anybody want to add anything for the good of all, for the joys and concerns?
I have a great joy. Our younger son Jim is now Colonel Gifford PhD.
Colonel,
Wow. Colonel, he became Colonel yesterday.
Jim,
what does
Yeah.
it feel like to be a mother of a colonel?
and
He's worked for it.
he's a PhD too.
And he just had, and I can't tell you where, but some military thing got published. And I can't understand what it's about, but he got
Yeah.
published too, so he's on a high right now.
I bet he is. That's great. We have a joy too. We got a FaceTime with our son and our grandson in Chicago, Parker, who graduated in December with his master's from OU, and he got a job. Just got a job. He got an offer. Forensic computer stuff. It's a company that does cybersecurity, and it sounds like if there's, I think the way it goes is, and you probably know this, that if there's a
If you
break,
get hacked, they figure it out.
yeah, they're the ones who come in and figure out how and why and all that kind of stuff. So we're pleased for that. What else do you have? You think between Lizzie and Dick? You keep them continuing. Let's join in prayer. Oh, excuse me.
Some surgery coming.